Hello. Today we have one of our introduction and signposting sessions to address specifically a request from this club to talk about RO crates. So personally, I hear a lot about them in my work, particularly where you have data and metadata being passed to analysis workflow. So we wanted to host a layperson summary of our road crates, but also invite a speaker with an operational working knowledge of them to be able to explore any depth in the discussion today, if that's where we end up going. So we're delighted to have Eli with us today. So he works as a senior software developer at the University of Manchester with a passion for reproducibility research. So Eli, we see a lot in the ELIXIR world, and really happy to have him here today. So could we get these slides set up, please, and start to share these, Eli?
Cool. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Eli from the University of Manchester, and I work on RO Crate as a project. So I'm not a particular domain specialist. I work with people from lots of different domains, but my focus is on packaging research outputs with their metadata for reproducibility. So I'm going to start with a bit of setting the scene, the motivations behind why RO-Crate exists, and then get into the kind of a little bit about how it works, a slight technical detail, but not too deep, and then get into some of the ways that RO-Crate is used in the life sciences, but also beyond the life sciences. So the motivations, RO-Crate comes out of this previous initiative called Fair Research Objects. And so the idea here is that a research object is any digital resource that aims to go beyond the PDF for scholarly publishing. So when we do research, we produce all sorts of things. As you all know, we produce data, we produce workflows, as well as papers and so on. And so the aim of this movement was to make data, code, and other resources these first-class citizens of scholarship, and to publish collections of resources together as like single shareable, citable resources. So a paper is properly linked to its data and the workflows that it uses and so on. And we want to be able to enrich these resources and collections with additional information that enables reusability and reproducibility. And that's where all the metadata comes in. And so the sort of the vision for RO Crate, and RO stands for Research Object, so it's Research Object Crate, is to take these different research outputs like publications, data, results, workflows that might all be published in different locations, and sort of conceptually box them up into a crate and link them together with something called linked open data. And this allows you to say, okay, this paper was written by these people and they used these workflows with this data and got these outputs. And you can link all those things together, even if they are published in different locations. And that makes all the research, ideally, more executable, more discoverable, and more reproducible. And so we have sort of three main aims for how RO-Crate tries to achieve this. Firstly, we try to be infrastructure independent, so we aren't tied to any particular repository or any particular service. We try to be practical, lightweight, and robust so that it can be adopted and integrated into a lot of different infrastructures. We try to make RO-Crate familiar and developer friendly, and we do that by using web native tools such as JSON or JSON LD, which is JSON for linked data. So the JSON data format is familiar to a lot of people already. It's machine and human readable. And the way RO-Crate is built, it's also search engine accessible because it uses a lot of the same underlying technologies as are used for search engine optimization. And then we also want to embrace the diversity of the research community, as well as sort of legacy applications, and things we didn't think about when Oracrate was initially being made. So Oracrate is deliberately open-ended, adaptable to different domains through what we call metadata profiles. And it tries to be entirely self-describing and to be able to act as an exchange format between different pieces of infrastructure. So it's trying to achieve a lot. And I'm going to talk briefly about how it works on a technical level. So if we have a folder with some data to publish, this is obviously a very simple example. We have a folder, it's got a CSV file in it with some data in. How do we turn this into an Oracrate? We add a special file called orocrate metadata.json. We populate this metadata file with some metadata, and then we distribute the whole folder together. And that's it. So the presence of this file is all that you need to do to make it an Oracrate. You don't need to change anything else about how your data is organized or structured. Now, obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that because you do have to write this metadata. And for that, we use, as I said, the JSON LD format. So this is a JSON-based linked data format. And it pulls in like vocabulary and ontology terms from a few different sources, one of those being schema.org. It's mainly based on schema.org, and then there are a few extensions. And basically, these give us standardized ways to describe the data sets and the contextual metadata. So who created this data? How was it created? What studies or projects is it associated with? Who funded it? And also, how can I use this information? How can I use this data? And we do that by building this sort of graph of relationships between different entities. So an entity might be a piece of data, or it might be a representation of a person. So you have sort of a data entity that has an author that is a person, or has a funder that's a particular organization. And all this gets connected to something called the root data entity, which is like that core central description of the data set that might be, again, published by a particular organization. And these kind of has part, author, funder, these are standardized terms coming from schema.org or other vocabularies. Now, you might be thinking about your particular use cases and thinking, oh, my data is sensitive, it can't actually be published. Or maybe your data is already served over an API through a particular data repository. Or maybe it's already been published and it already has a DOI and it hasn't got this metadata file in it. In those cases, you can still use Oracrate. You can use what we call a detached Oracrate, where the metadata is kind of detached from the data it's describing. You create this metadata JSON file somewhere else, and you reference the data using its persistent identifiers if it has a DOI, or describing, where else in a system to find it. Like you can find it at this like URL for an API endpoint. Or if the data can't be published at all, you can just say, this data exists, it lives somewhere, maybe it has particular access controls that you can describe, but the data itself is not directly accessible from within the crate. And then you distribute this metadata file somewhere else. And so what we end up with is RO crates that are interconnected, not just within themselves, but also more broadly. So within a crate, you have this graph, you have this core descriptor that links to the data files, but also to contextual references. And then this data set, when you might publish it, you give it a DOI. And then another RO crate might represent a published paper, and that paper might reference this data set using its persistent identifier and say this paper is about this data set. Or you might have a workflow that uses this data set as an input. And then other things on the internet might reference those things and so on. And you build up what we call a knowledge graph. And this can also be interconnected with other knowledge graph infrastructures, such as OpenAir, is one of the existing ones that gets a lot of its metadata from places like Zenodo. This is entirely compatible with that kind of infrastructure. And of course, FAIR is not just about machine readability. So on the left is a snippet of the top of an RO-crate metadata file. And on the right is that converted to a web representation. So when people are creating RO-crates, we have tools that can convert the JSON into a like a web page that's much more human readable, and you can click on links to sort of explore around the crate. And then we get to how you apply RO-crate in particular communities. We have this idea called RO-crate profiles, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So these are community-developed extensions to RO-crate. They're sets of rules and expectations for the structure and metadata of RO-crates in a particular area. So some of these are domain-focused. So we have profiles that are centered around earth sciences or biodiversity genomics, and they say, if you're doing this kind of research, you should be including this kind of metadata in your crates. That might be about, the specific species that you're studying if you're doing a biodiversity or genomics kind of study. But then we also have profiles that are focused more on specific types of data, such as workflows or data that follows the investigation, study, assay, or ISA model. Or if you're using electronic lab notebooks, there's an RO-crate profile that's focused on how to convert an electronic lab notebook into RO-crate format. And these two sort of types of focus, they aren't mutually exclusive. So you could have a biodiversity genomics focused crate that includes all of that stuff, but it also includes like workflow information. So you can combine profiles and you can extend them. And here I have a sort of inheritance diagram based on rubber ducks. This is like a family tree of a specific grouping of RO-crate profiles that's all about describing workflows. So you start with a workflow RO-crate, and then you can add more metadata about a workflow execution, and it becomes a workflow run RO-crate. And then you can add even more metadata to fill out the provenance even more fully. And then you get this provenance RO-crate. And so you can use any of these profiles at any level. It's just like the level of detail that they offer you, they build on each other. And we have a whole ecosystem of tools around helping you to create RO-crates, convert between formats, whatever language you're using. So we have libraries in a number of different languages. This isn't even a complete list because I know we have a Rust library as well, and probably a couple of others. And then we have some visualization tools, we have some graphical editors, we have validation tools, and so on. So there's a lot in the ecosystem. It's a global community, and all of these tools are open source. So to kind of summarize the benefits of RO-crate in these software ecosystems, it supports reliable data consumption because it's got this standardized packaging method. It enables you to share data across different tools, services, and repositories, and we'll see some examples of that in a minute. And the key thing is data is then always traveling with its metadata. So that includes the persistent identifiers, the provenance, and annotations with particular ontologies. And this enhances reproducibility because then data sets are linked to workflows and so on. And it also enables those sensitive data sets to still be described and move between secure environments with clear governance because you can describe things like access controls. So now we get onto the different ways that RO-crate is being used around the world. So here's a quick slide with just a bunch of different logos on. You may recognize some of these. RO-crate is used in a lot of different places. We have a use cases page on the RO-crate website where you can browse these and also filter them by different domains or tasks or roles. And so, yeah, there are a lot of different domains where RO-crate is used. Some of the biggest ones are life sciences, health, and bioinformatics, but there's also users in plant sciences, material science, language and cultural heritage, climate science. Um, and all of these push RO-Crate in different directions and really have, yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff happening in all the different domains. And I'm going to highlight, in any domain, there are many ways to use RO-Crate, and I'm going to highlight three of those main ones and then tie them to specific applications. So we have workflows, data archiving, and trusted research environments. So the workflow services ecosystem is the one that you're likely to have come across before if you are closely involved in Elixir. We have, over the course of quite a few years, built up this this ecosystem of different services and tools. So we have at the core Workflow Hub, which is a workflow registry. And whenever you register a workflow on Workflow Hub, you can automatically export it as a workflow RO-Crate. So that's the description of the workflow in RO-Crate format. Workflow Hub is then integrated with a number of different workflow platforms, such as Galaxy and Wifex. And these enable workflow executions to be exported as RO-Crates as well. And there's, I know, especially with Galaxy, there's like a two-way integration between Workflow Hub and Galaxy. And then you can write tests for your workflows and then register them with Life Monitor. And again, that can be captured in RO-Crate. And then we have, those sort of exporting options, which allow you to send workflows or workflow execution results to platforms like Zenodo. And this has been built up through lots of different projects, many of which have their logos here. And so RO-Crates act as an exchange format, and also a way to capture the provenance of data that's moved around this ecosystem. So the RO-Crates can include the contributors to a workflow, the license, the workflow systems it's using, the workflow files themselves, but also their interoperable workflow descriptions sometimes, which can be written using CWL, the common workflow language. They can optionally include things like tools, software citations, like the tools that are used in the workflow, any data sources that might be required, test suites, as I said, and then when you execute the workflow, you get this additional layer of provenance. And a lot of this happens without the user needing to know very much about RO-Crate. So when you upload to Workflow Hub, you automatically get an RO-Crate. When you run a workflow in Galaxy or Wifex, you automatically get an RO-Crate out. And so you get all the benefits of having this provenance without having to know like the nitty-gritty of how it's working. One particular way this is really useful is in the context of digital twins. So we have a few different examples of this on the RO-Crate website, but one of them is the Biodiversity Digital Twin project. This was a project that made a bunch of different digital twin prototypes for different areas of biodiversity studies. And some of those workflows are registered on Workflow Hub. And in particular, the prototype digital twin that was developed for studying wild relatives of crops. The execution, whenever that digital twin executes this particular workflow, the execution gets exported as a workflow run RO-Crate and gets sent to the destination Earth data lake. So that can then be retrieved and rerun in future, or just investigated to see like how was this, what was the environment that this this workflow was running in. A second major use of RO-Crate is in this data archiving context. So RO-Crate's really well suited to long-term archival, and indeed this is one of its original aims. So it's got this clearly defined specification. It's built on these well-supported web technologies, so a lot of things can interoperate with it by default. You can use RO-Crate with any kind of data, and it also aims to be self-describing and self-contained. So you should be able to take an RO-Crate metadata file, and it could be completely isolated from the rest of the world, and it can still work to describe to you what is this data and what is this crate about. And so on the right are a few different logos of a few different platforms that support RO-Crate. Either they support it natively in their data model, or they convert to or from another data model. So FairdMSeek is a platform that underpins Workflow Hub, has its own internal data model, but does that conversion to and from RO-Crate, whereas RO Hub uses RO-Crate natively. And then in some cases, you have third-party tools, like we have a Python package that can convert RO-Crates to DataCite format, which is what Zenodo wants to ingest. So there are two use cases I want to highlight here, both coming from outside the life sciences domain. One is from the Language Data Commons of Australia. They have these huge collections of cultural heritage data sets, and they're multimedia. So they have like handwritten documents as well as like recorded audio, and it's this whole mixture of data. And they have these really large nested collections. And they have built an RO-Crate native data platform called Paradisec, on which they are archiving all that information with the intent that it can be retrieved like long term. And then in Hungary, the national research infrastructure has this tool called Aroma. And this is a data repository and RO-Crate manager tool, and it's a custom Dataverse instance with extensions that allow RO-Crate metadata to be edited directly in the browser. So again, the user doesn't need to have any understanding of RO-Crate, but they're still able to reap the benefits of it. And the final big use of RO-Crates that I want to talk about is trusted research environments, or TREs. These are also known as secure data environments or data safe havens. They've got a few different names. But the aim is usually the same. You have sensitive data, such as health data, that needs to be used in research, but also the data cannot be shared. It can't be made open. Maybe the outputs can if they're sufficiently anonymized, but there are a lot of processes in place that make sure that the people that access the data are safe and that the data is sufficiently isolated from the internet and all of these things. And we have these principles called the 5 safes principles, which are all about the governance needed to make sure that research that is done on sensitive data is done safely. And we now have an RO-Crate profile that aims to capture the provenance of those kinds of processes. So even if you can't publish the data that was used in the workflow, you can still publish metadata about the processes of like sign off, the workflow execution environment, the disclosure control processes that happened. And you can publish that metadata even if you can't reveal all the data itself or the data is behind specific access controls. We're working on this a lot in the UK at the moment with these projects HDR-UK and Truevolution, but then also in a European context with the Entrust project, which is trying to network different trusted research environments within Europe together. And there's also a use case for this within ELIXIR, within the Human Data and Translational Research Program. There's a work package which we call FedA-Crate. And this is all about, we want to do federated learning within a trusted research environment. So train a model on sensitive data and publish the model without publishing the data, and capturing information about the provenance of those kinds of machine learning training processes. And so this is important for making sure that AI and machine learning models are trustworthy. We want to have a good understanding of what data went in and the parameters that we used for training. Even if we can't actually access that data ourselves. So this is a project we're working on actively at the moment. We've made a first draft of a federated learning RO-Crate profile to capture that kind of information about the training process in an RO-Crate. And then our next step is to apply that to a trusted research environment context. So capture information, capture provenance of a training process that's being run on sensitive data in line with those 5 safes processes. So we're going to combine the federated learning profile with the 5 safes RO-Crate profile to get this really rich and complex metadata that hopefully captures everything that we need to capture. So that was a real whistle-stop tour of a lot of different RO-Crate things. But to summarize, RO-Crate is easy to adopt, it's easy to consume, it's naturally interoperable and interconnected with the wider web, and it's highly customizable for domain-specific needs. We strongly encourage that. And we have a global, as I said, a global open source community, and we have beginner-friendly drop-in sessions. So we'll obviously have some discussion time now, but if you want to come and discuss more, in particular, I run the European, Middle East, and Africa regional calls twice a month. And yeah, you're always welcome there. And then if you are better located for American or Oceanic, like Asia Pacific time zones, there are calls for those areas too. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, we have the RO-Crate website, which has lots more information on, and here's my email.